Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Johanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Ashley Kerr. Ashley Kerr is an associate professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Idaho. As an undergraduate, Kerr spent a year living in Chile. After graduation, she taught English in Argentine Patagonia as a Fulbright English teaching assistant. She has also taught abroad in Valencia, Spain, Montevideo, Uruguay, and sailed around the Atlantic as a faculty member on semester at sea. At the University of Idaho, she teaches upper-level courses on Latin American culture, literature, and film. Her research focuses on race and gender in Argentina and Uruguay in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her first book, Sex, Skulls, and Citizens, Gender and Racial Science in Argentina, was named the 2020 Best Book by the 19th Century Studies section of the Latin American Studies Association. Ashley, thank you for joining me today to talk about the research you have done on the Buenos Aires Zoo and how it was used to shape society at the turn of the last century.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna, and thank you to everyone that's listening. I like your turn of the last century. That's something I'm debating in my head. When I say turn of the century, do people know which turn I'm talking about?
I don't think they do. Now we have to specify. I'm talking about 1900, which is
Exactly.
what we're focusing on today. So I'm really curious to learn, how did you become interested in Latin America?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I went to college, I went to Middlebury College in Vermont. I thought that I was going to be a biology major. And it took only one lab class where I was counting saplings under 4 inches of snow before I decided that I actually didn't want to be a biology major. And I had enrolled in a Spanish class because I had taken some in high school as well. And I really enjoyed it. And then decided to be a Latin American studies major because I wouldn't have to pick any particular department. I could take classes in every department as long as it had to do with Latin America. So I did that. I studied abroad in Chile, like you mentioned, and really loved it and wanted to find ways to go back. But honestly, I went to grad school in Spanish because I wasn't really sure what else to do after I graduated. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to try this and see how it goes. And it turns out that I really liked it and I was pretty good at teaching. So that's how I've ended up here.
I love that story. You can follow your heart through school and end up where you should be.
Well, and now I end up talking about animals, which is basically biology anyway. So I've really come full circle.
Yeah, we will be very biology heavy today. You have written about the Buenos Aires Zoo, and I'm really curious how you got into that history.
Yeah, so the zoo in Buenos Aires, I came about in two different ways, really, that came together. So the first is that I had been to Buenos Aires many times and I had visited the zoo. And it's right in the sort of the center of a major part of town, and everybody has a story about when they went to the zoo as a kid or things they remember from that. So that was always in the back of my mind. And then my first book, which you mentioned, Sex, Skulls, and Citizens, is about early Argentine anthropology and its relationship to indigenous people. And one of the anthropologists whose work I was looking at was an Italian who had moved to Argentina named Clemente Onelli. And Onelli went on to become the second director of the Buenos Aires Zoo, whereas another one of the scientists I had looked at briefly was the first director of the zoo. And so I sort of was interested in these two figures. And then COVID hit, and I was sitting there going, what am I going to do for my next project? And because it was COVID and I couldn't go anywhere, I was searching through online databases, just reading old magazines. And I discovered that in Caras y Caretas, which was one of the most popular weekly magazines in the early 20th century, there were articles about the zoo and its animals every single issue. And some of them were factual articles like, this is what the zoo animals eat, a day in the life of the director. But there were also cartoons using some of the animals. There would be poems about them. When a baby elephant died, there was a eulogy for her that was printed in this magazine. And so I kind of started thinking about this and wondering, okay, what can I do with this zoo? And then, yeah, I started researching it. I had a sabbatical last year and I was able to go to Argentina for the fall semester. And I basically went to the current zoo and said, hey, I'm here. Do you have any sort of archive? And I must have gotten extremely lucky because there was a very kind woman named Maria Jose Micale who's in charge of heritage. And she said, actually, we have 2 rooms filled with boxes. We have no idea what's in the boxes. The boxes have no odor. They haven't been cleaned. So you'll want to wear a mask and gloves. But I am happy to give you the run of those boxes. You can open anything up you want as long as you put it back when you're done. And so I spent 3 or 4 months going through these boxes, and she gave me this space. It was really interesting. I was in a room that was right next to the zoo's kitchens where they made the food for the animals, and it had big glass windows, and I could see the free range roaming animals outside. So there'd be peacocks coming by, or Patagonian maras, which are kind of like a rabbit or a hare, as I'm sitting here going through these boxes that had documents from 1900 and also every receipt that was ever printed in 1990. So I've just been putting that all together now in writing this book.
Wow, that sounds like a historian's dream come
It's
true.
so much fun. I had the best time just going through. You never knew what you were going to find. And in the location that I was in, it was great. You know, my daughter, who was 7 at the time, would tell everybody, my mommy works at the zoo. Only half true.
Yeah, well, lucky her. So the zoo has a really interesting history around its founding. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Buenos Aires Zoo was originally part of a big park in Palermo, which was a formerly aristocratic neighborhood. And in 1875, the president decided, okay, we're going to create this park. And the goal will be to make a democratic space where everybody is just a person. We don't have rich or poor. We don't have foreigners. We don't have, native Argentines. And so we created this very big park. In 1888, the zoo became an independent institution. And these dates are sort of interesting because if we think about zoos in the US, sort of as our comparative reference, the Philadelphia Zoo, which is the first zoo in the United States, is founded in 1874, so the year before the Buenos Aires Zoo starts to exist. The National Zoo in Washington, D.C. isn't founded until after in 1889. And I looked up, Zoo Boise was founded in 1916. So Argentina is
Okay.
actually on the earlier side in terms of having a zoo. And yeah, in the early years, the zoo was meant to be a space where people could go, learn about animals, relax a bit, and there would be scientific programming happening too. So scientists studying the animals. At the time, there were really no veterinarians, so human doctors would come and do experiments on the animals and vice versa. And then by the time the second director takes over around 1904, there's also a push to make the zoo more fun to attract people. So they install a Ferris wheel, they have a miniature train. You can take a ride on a camel or a pony or a llama, and they start to have more of these elements incorporated. And the zoo becomes so popular because of the programming, because of the animals, and because of all of these stories about the zoo that are being published, that by 1911, it's the most visited zoo in the world. So there are more visitors in absolute numbers to the Buenos Aires Zoo than there are to New York, than there are to Paris, to London. And that number is about 1.5 million people, which was more than the population of the city at the time. So obviously some of those are people going multiple times, those visits, but it just tells you the importance, right, that this space had and how fast it really rose to become sort of a central part of social, cultural life in the city.
Absolutely. So at this same time period, the early 1900s, Argentines were arguing about social problems as well. They were broadly titled La Cuestión Social. What were the issues that they were talking about and thinking about?
Yeah. So the zoo in Argentina is sort of born and develops at a very interesting period of time in Argentine history. So by the late 19th century, Argentina has been independent for 70, 80 years. They've just undergone a series of civil wars and infighting to try to establish what the country is going to look like, who the capital or where the capital is going to be. They have engaged in wars against indigenous populations and forced cultural conversion, which is a lot of what I talk about in my first book. And Argentina has had for many, many years a very open immigration policy. So some of the early elites essentially thought, well, the way to make this country a modern nation and to kind of move up in the world is to bring in immigrants from Europe. And so they don't have any sort of laws or restrictions on who can come. They send different agents over to Europe to try to recruit people to immigrate to Argentina. And that's starting to bear fruit at this time. So we are seeing a huge increase in the number of foreigners. Between 1881 and 1930, 5.8 million people immigrated to Argentina. So this is a huge number.
Wow.
Yeah, and in Buenos Aires, in the capital, which is a port city, the percentage of foreigners is extremely high during the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. So we're seeing that. Argentina is economically developing, beginning to integrate into the world market as a provider of raw materials, and particularly agriculture. So if you've ever heard about Argentine beef, right, being some very, very good steak, that is somewhat starting from this period of time. And so we have a city where you're rapidly increasing the population, you're increasing the diversity of the population because you're getting immigrants from all over. It's a city that's starting to see industrialization, that's growing faster, honestly, than they can build places for people to live. And that is also starting to see the development of a lot of cultural institutions like the zoo, like museums, like the opera house, things like that. So all of this sounds really great on the surface. You've got new people, you've got new energy, you've got new economic developments. But this influx of people and this influx of change also caused a lot of anxiety. I think as people, we don't like change. I know I don't like change very much. And all of a sudden, the people in charge were looking around going, what even is Argentina anymore? Who is an Argentine? We have all of this diversity that we didn't have before. Is this positive? They saw an increase in poverty, right? Because many of the people that were coming were working in factories. They weren't being paid well. They were living in tenement houses where conditions were very poor. There one toilet for, 60 people, people living packed into small rooms, a rise in disease. They often attributed to immigrants in the working class a susceptibility to alcoholism, to insanity, and to other problems. And then they also saw that there was a rise in movements like anarchism, which really did come with Spanish and Italian immigrants for the most part. But they saw this as causing more social disorder. So these ruling elites who were from the same families that had been in power for many, many years looked around and went, this is not good. What do we do? And their answer, of course, is not like, oh, maybe we need to think about our social structure and how we're paying people, but rather like they're clearly things that are biologically and culturally wrong with all of these people. We need to find ways to fix that.
And we should be fair to that this was happening all over the world, not just in Argentina, but in the United States, in many cities, in Europe. So how, this wasn't unique to Argentina, but they have their own groups who were looking at those problems and trying to figure out how to solve them. So what were some of the different schools of thought about this?
Yeah. So again, like you said, this is happening all over the world at the time period. And in fact, the Argentines are reading the textbooks and the pamphlets that are published around the world and sending out their own as well. So there are many, many schools of thought at the time. Obviously, different groups have different affinities. There was a significant anarchist population and anarchist press that basically said the solution is to burn it all down, right? The Socialist Party grows to power here and is looking at organizing labor, and particularly saying, hey, the way to take care of these social problems is to ensure that workers are paid more, have rights, and work in better conditions, right? So that's one way to approach it. Different ethnic collectives formed their own sort of mutual aid societies, worked together. Education is a big factor at this time period. Argentina institutes secular education at the end of the 19th century, mandatory elementary education at the very beginning of the 20th century. So there's a lot of focus on education reform as a way of moving the country forward. And then I would argue that probably one of the most important ways of thinking about this is from the group of sort of technocrats that said, hey, science will solve everything. If we just study our country and our people empirically, and we basically treat them as if we were doctors and they are patients, or the country is our patient, and there are these social problems that are the ills that we need to cure, then we can come up with preventative actions and with cures for this. And so the focus very much becomes on public health and hygiene. And so things like requiring immigrants who arrive in the country to be inspected by doctors and quarantined if they come bearing any illnesses. There's the development of early, really early eugenics in a lot of ways, early racial science, arguing that certain groups of immigrants, certain religious groups even, maybe are more susceptible to certain diseases and therefore need to be treated in certain ways. There's sort of a large scale locking up of those deemed criminally insane or otherwise unhealthy. And so a lot of things that are looking to try to better society, but are often infringing on individual rights, right? Now, of course, not everything they did was quite like that. They also encouraged things like hand washing as a way to lessen the amount of disease. And of course, that's a very positive action to be taking. But yeah, so it was really just this like, if we study it and we take care of it, then we will grow as a country and we can sort of reach the glory that we are destined to have.
You argue that some of the city's elites believed that the zoo could be used to shape society. Why the zoo?
What, you don't automatically think of zoos when you're thinking about trying to take care of, social problems?
Maybe I should be, but no.
Well, let me convince you on why you could think that
Okay.
way, or at least why people did think that way, at least in Argentina. And I think this is actually something as well that you could probably make an argument for in zoos around the world. But it's not one that is frequently made, I think, largely because zoos in Europe and the US, which are most of the zoos that have been studied, are often viewed in connection to imperialism. So if you get animals from other countries, you can show your power over them and things like that. And that's not the case in Argentina. And that's really where I started with this project. I was like, well, if it's not an imperial zoo, what is it doing? And yes, like you said, I think they're using it to shape society. And your question of why is a good one. And it's actually, I think, pretty easy in some ways to answer. The number of people that go to the zoo, right? I mean, if I'm talking about 1.5 million visitors in 1911, that's far more visitors than to any other cultural institution in the country at the time. And in fact,
Absolutely.
I found a cartoon, a political cartoon from the time period that has two senators talking to each other. And the one says, if we want to fix up this country, we should look around, and nobody goes to libraries or museums, and everybody goes to the zoo. So we really ought to just shutter the libraries and the museums and put all of our money into making the zoo bigger, right? And I think that cartoon is sort of emblematic of this. The other thing is, not only is the zoo incredibly popular in terms of numbers, the population that goes to the zoo really encompasses all of Argentine society. So museums are another place that are frequently used at the end of the 19th century to try to shape people, their identity, their relationship to the nation. But museums are often only accessible to a particular sector of the population, right? A sector of a population that has the free time to go to a museum, has the money to pay the admission if there is one, and often that is literate in order to be able to read the displays and things like that. Most of that's not applicable to the zoo. So the zoo is open 7 days a week. So people that work during the week can go on the weekends. It's open relatively long hours, usually from dawn till dusk, right? There was an admission cost to the Buenos Aires Zoo, but it was 10 cents, which was relatively affordable. It was free one Sunday a month. School children, veterans were always free. And so lots of people could go to the zoo, and they could target particularly immigrants, the working class, children who are our future. And so it really brought together this absolute numbers factor, but also the fact that it was the very people that those in charge thought that they had to change who were going to the zoo.
So how did the zoo shape the debate around immigration?
Yeah, so immigration is really, like I was saying, one of the biggest debates at the time. In the beginning, the idea was that immigration was great. The thought was that they would get all of these white Northern Europeans, English perhaps, that would come and would be very industrious and productive. And what actually ended up happening was that most of the immigrants came from Southern Europe, from Italy, from Spain, and then later from more Eastern Europe. And the way that people thought about those immigrants was very different. There were the stereotypes of the Southern European as being lazy, taking the siesta. Spain, actually, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression that Africa begins at the Pyrenees. It's this idea that, Spain and Portugal are actually North African countries because of their history. And again, anarchism is an idea that comes with the Spanish and Italian immigrants. And so immigration by this period of time is starting to look a little bit more questionable. Was this a good idea? Who are we now? And can we make them assimilate essentially? Or are they always going to be Italians living in Argentina? And so these were questions that people were asking, and I argue that the zoo was a great place to talk about them for a couple of different reasons. So the first is the argument that goes on behind the scenes at all zoos, which is what's the proper ratio of exotic foreign animals to local species, right? And this comes down to a question of what's the purpose of zoos. If zoos are meant to entertain, then we want to have elephants and rhinos and hippos and all of them. If zoos are meant to educate and have conservation, then perhaps we need to have more of our local species in the zoo. But maybe those aren't as exciting to people and therefore won't bring in as many visitors. And in Argentina, something really interesting happens that I haven't noticed in reading about zoos in other parts of the world, is that zoo animals are frequently talked about as either native Argentines or immigrants. And I think the metaphor that we, at least today, often think about with zoo animals is maybe more connected to like slavery, that these are forced workers, that they are in cages and things like that. But in Argentina, they're talking about them as immigrants. So there was a giraffe named Mimi who came from Senegal. And when she arrived, there were a series of photos of her arriving at the docks, and it had everything labeled as if she were a human. So it talked about how she had to go through customs with her baggage. It talked about how she got to be in first class because she was a more privileged animal and therefore didn't have to go through the same health controls as third class passengers. And then there was a poem that appeared in one newspaper that talked about how she was so sad and nostalgic and homesick for her country, which are, of course, all very human behaviors and emotions that were being placed on this giraffe. And so in my research, what I've found is that because of how they were conceptualizing these animals, the debates over whether it was better to have foreign exotic animals or native species often seemed to stand in for debates over whether it was better to have human foreigners or human natives, essentially, which I thought was pretty interesting. Also, baby animals. So Argentina, the Buenos Aires Zoo, was the first zoo in the world to have an elephant born in captivity that survived. And this was in 1904. Her name was Victoria Fua. The Fua was from her parents' name, and the Victoria was victory. And then her last name was Porteña, which means someone of the port city of Buenos Aires. And there are all of these stories and cartoons talking about how she is an authentic Argentine and she has her citizenship papers, which is really interesting to me when we think about animals in general. So, if a rhino is born in Idaho, is it from Africa still? Is it an Idaho rhino? What makes an animal a citizen or not a citizen? And so I think these are all ways of sort of exploring these questions for humans. For instance, in Argentina at the time, anyone born in the Argentine territory was Argentine. So children of immigrants were Argentines and therefore were not necessarily a problem. And I think that they're talking about elephants in the same way to sort of process these ideas. They also did experiments with, can you bring a Highlander cow from Scotland and move it to Argentina? Will it adapt? Will it won't? Which they then use to talk about, like, can human beings physically adapt and biologically adapt to new climates or not? And then I think you can talk about the zoo as a sort of a place of patriotism of, this is our zoo. These are our animals. There's a great anecdote I found in a paper about how there was apparently a man who would sit outside the zoo gates, and when the school children would come on their field trips, he would start just like giving speeches about these Argentine founding fathers and national heroes. And this image just to me really illustrates that the zoo was a place where, yeah, you could have these diverse groups of children coming in, but they were being educated and, being an Argentine, both in terms of the history and we control this land, we control these animals. This is our culture. This is something Argentine.
That's so wonderful, actually, to hear all of the different ways that people are looking at the animals and thinking about the animals. It sounds then like journalists and publishers and media were a big part of that group that was trying to kind of use the zoo as a way to explore these issues. Is
Yeah,
that right?
that's absolutely right. And, in some cases, it's actually the zoo directors that are inviting them in or handing them materials to publish. In others, it's just them going of their own accord. There's a famous Uruguayan author named Horacio Quiroga, who's known for his short stories, but also lived in Argentina and published with a few of these papers. And I actually have a note where one of the publishers was like, "We want more stuff from you, particularly notes about the zoo." And I think, that's what people wanted to read. The other
So it
thing
was
that
also popular
was
with
so popular to
the
read,
public. Yeah.
absolutely, all of these stories, they would have, like, when a foreign monkey would come visit, so um, chimpanzees, right? So you would get some famous European chimpanzees that would come, and they would pretend to have interviews with them. And so there's an interview with this chimpanzee named Consul, and they're like, "So what do you think of Buenos Aires?" Right? And he's like, "Yeah, it's not bad. I like this, I like that." But really, everybody lives in these enclosed houses, which is terrible for their health. And he's talking about hygiene and the importance of ventilation, right? Through this visiting chimpanzee they're pretending to interview.
I'm thinking of like a crocodile with a toothbrush also for
Uh,
kids today. What about the role of women in society? Is that something that was addressed through the zoo?
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the areas that I first started noticing when I was working on this project, in part because I think as a mother, it's something that I'm frequently attuned to, but also the fact that we think of zoos as being places for children a lot of times. Um, and in terms of gender, if we go back to this cuestión social we mentioned, this idea of resolving all of these social problems, really no matter what group people identified with, so the anarchists, the Socialist Party, some of these oligarchs from the more conservative political parties, the Catholic Church, just about everybody viewed women as an important part of fixing these problems. Because women were caregivers, right? Women were the ones that would raise the next generation. And so they argued in their own ways and in accordance with their own ideologies that if we could get women to do the things we wanted them to do, particularly in their role as mothers, then we could work our way out of these problems. And so
So
this,
did they,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, did they see women as a partner in this effort, or they wanted to determine the policies and then have women implement them?
Depended on the group. The
Okay.
relationship to it was very, very different. For instance, you might have socialists advocating for better working conditions for women and a shorter working day so that they could spend time at home with their children. So they're saying, hey, women can work and be part of this, but we also need to protect this motherhood side. Whereas other groups might have a different approach. So in terms of the zoo, what I've found has been very interesting, and it really ranges from these metaphorical uses of the animals to very hands-on concrete policies to improve mother-child health. So in terms of the more metaphorical, in all of these zoo stories that we've been talking about, they almost always are, and in the zoo guidebooks, because I also have access to most of the zoo guidebooks from this time period, they talk about the animals in terms of stable, heterosexual family pairings that are designed for reproduction, which of course is the ideal for building the nation at the time. And so they'll always talk about, the mom camel and the dad camel and the baby camel. And the way that they talk about it is interesting because the phrase legítimamente casados, so legitimately married, comes up frequently. It's like, what does it mean to be legitimately married if you're a monkey, right? Or an elephant? And I think it's just reinforcing this overarching importance on we want stable marriages, we want people reproducing so that we can build the population of the nation. Argentina is a very large country. It had a lot of space to fill in, essentially. And then they contrast this with certain species of monkeys that live in common cages. So they're not living in family unions. And they talk about how these are very promiscuous monkeys. They're poorly behaved. They're beating their wives. They're sleeping around.
Oh my word.
Very much this like judgmental view of how you should be living and how you shouldn't through zoo animals. And of course, these have nothing to do, usually these representations, with how animals actually live, right? The other things that I've seen too are the idea of good mothers and bad mothers. So for instance, in the zoo guide for many years, it describes the lionesses they have. And one of the lionesses is an exemplary mother, and it describes what she does. And one is a very bad mother who deserves to have her babies taken away. So again,
Oh dear.
yeah, right. Like it's some degree of observing animal behavior, but also a large degree of sort of prescribing for the human visitors who are reading this guide. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't. There's a hippo that's apparently very good at breastfeeding, and a magazine writes about how this hippo should be an example to all those women who are selfish and choose to use wet nurses so that they can protect their figure.
Oh my goodness.
Right? So we're incorporating hippos into our shaming of women now, right? Mothers.
Over. Oh,
Um,
it just makes me so sad to hear that that kind of shaming over breastfeeding was happening
happening even back in the day,
even
right?
back in these days. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so they had this, but then they also would have things. They actually built a space. It's a replica of the Temple of Hercules, specifically as a breastfeeding and nursery space for women and their children. Or they participated in the Semana del Niño, the Children's Week, one year, which brought poor mothers and their children to different institutions around the city, provided them with food, provided them with education on hygiene, and things like that. So there was also this, it's not just, hey, this hippo is shaming you, but also here, come to the zoo and we will teach you and provide you with the things that you need in order to be a better mother.
Support you in that role.
Yeah, within sort of a limited idea of
A
support.
very limited scope of support. Yeah. During this time, there was also a lot of unrest and controversy about labor.
Mhm.
How was the zoo involved in labor movements and those debates?
Yeah. So this is the area I would say of the book that is to me the most complex and at times contradictory, largely because I think the labor movement in general and in Argentina in particular was pretty complex and contradictory at the time. So one thing I noticed in looking at zoo design, in reading the guidebooks and reading these stories about the zoo is how the zoo animals are largely depicted as aristocrats. So they all live in things like the Bear Palace, right? And they're described as royalty. There's a column that appears in the zoo's journal regularly that describes, it's essentially the society pages of the zoo. And it'll talk about, such and such animal welcomed their new baby and it was celebrated with a 5 o'clock tea. These animals have gone off to their summer homes, things like that. And so we
Right.
have this aspect of it, right? And they're contrasted with the animals that work at the zoo, which are like the cart horses that have to you pull the carts of food for the different animals. He also, the one zoo director writes repeatedly about how his upper class animals don't like poor people that come to the zoo. And that there was, for instance, a gibbon that roamed around and would he would behave with children and well-dressed visitors, but he would try to bite the poor workers that were at the zoo. And also was most vicious with alcoholics, is what he wrote. So to me,
Oh
that's an
my.
juxtaposition in terms of labor and social class. But then there's also the fact that really behind the scenes, these aren't aristocrats. These are zoo animals that are encaged, that don't have a lot of enrichment, don't have any sort of freedom. Zoo conditions were not great at this time, largely because of financial restraints. And so I think there was actually a lot more in common between these animals and the workers and the poor visitors than maybe is popularly shown. But these animals also are used in representations to talk about labor and labor rights and things like that. So this aristocratic zoo is often used in the newspapers and in these magazines to critique society and advocate for better human conditions. And the way they do this is by frequently talking about how the animals at the zoo live better than the poor in the city. When World War I happens, Argentina stays neutral, but because of the war and because of poor harvests, the cost of food jumps very, very high. And this one magazine actually turns to the zoo as an example of this, because there was a sign in front of the lion cage that would explain what they ate every day. And in this cartoon, they have a man who stares up at the lion cage and looks really dismayed. And he reads out that, they're giving them 10 kilos of beef on Mondays, 11 of veal on Tuesdays. And he says, well, until we resolve this crisis, I'm going to request a room in this hotel. And so there's this idea like you're better off living in a lion cage than living on your own in the city. At the same time, and this is where I start to kind of go in circles, is this one director was extremely anti-communist and used animal representations to demonstrate that. So he seems to have been very kind to his own workers. And he even participates in some of the public universities created by the Socialist Party. But he uses, for instance, birds to basically say that communists are terrible. He talks about how sparrows come in and steal the other birds' nests at the zoo. And he says that they're like taking over for the good people and using their spaces. And this is a demonstration of how communism is actually a parasitic relationship. And so, yeah, there's just all of this back and forth. The other little sort of anecdote that I'll mention relating to labor is that the zoo directors actually complain quite frequently because the zoo is right next to sort of a broad avenue in Buenos Aires that was often used as a site for protesting. And so when workers would go and protest on this site, they would set off fireworks or they'd have drums, and it would scare these animals. And there were several cases of deer who got so frightened, for instance, that they ran into the bars of their cage and got so injured that they died. So there's also this
Oh
other
no.
relationship between animals and labor, where labor activism is affecting the sort of conditions of living for these animals. So yeah, so I guess for this question, I don't think there's one narrative. It's very complex, but it's really interesting to look at. I also have access from when I was in the archives to all of their records of who worked at the zoo. And the vast majority of them are immigrants who are illiterate. And it ranges from, they had a lot of child labor at the zoo, all the way up to people who, it would be in the records, we'd see like they were asking for leave one day, and then the next day there'd be a note being like, actually that person died. And so they're working all the way up until their 80s or until they're so old that they basically just die as soon as they leave the space. So that's been interesting to see too, because I think we don't often think of the workers at the zoo as an integral part of it. But obviously without the human workers, there's no zoo.
Absolutely. So it sounds like the zoo really was central in a lot of these debates, and not with one narrative or one point of view, but it's really complicated and messy and nuanced.
You've got it. I frequently joke with people that there's no issue or moment in Argentine history at this time that I can't connect to the zoo somehow. I think I could find you an example of almost anything happening at the zoo, or the zoo being used to talk about almost anything. And you're right. One of the parts that I'm working on now is these are all of the plans that the zoo elites had. But the truth of the matter is, just because they want people to interpret the zoo animals in a particular way or behave in a certain way at the zoo, people don't do that. Even at the zoo today, people are trying to feed the animals, right? They can't even get them not to do that. And so I'm looking at the ways that, yeah, some of these populations, these poor workers, even anarchists, how do they use the zoo and stories about the zoo for their own purposes? As well as how do the animals react to this, right? It's all very well and good to say, I'm going to make an exemplary mother out of this lion. But we have very little control over lion behavior. So like what happens when your exemplary animal actually kills her baby? Or what happens when you're talking about all of these animals living in heterosexual pairings, and you've got species like ostriches and emus who famously exist in homosexual pairs as well. And so I think that's the kind of final little interesting bit of this story is, yeah, you can try to do all of this, but there was constantly pushback from people and animals, both intentional and not so intentional, that really complicated this story and complicated these projects.
So what are the next steps for you with this amazing research that you've done?
Yeah, so I am finishing up the book manuscript now. It will hopefully be published in about a year. I After this, then too, there's so many other little side stories that come along with this that I want to tell the story of. I haven't mentioned it at all, but there's sort of a history of indigenous people in the zoo, not in the zoo as specimens, but their relationship to the zoo and its animals. The zoo had an aviculture school, a poultry husbandry school for many years. And so I want to tell the story of what are they doing with all of these chickens at the zoo. And so I think
What's that about?
yeah, right, exactly. Like, why is the zoo having a chicken school, an egg school? And why did it matter? Actually, at one point they were giving thousands of eggs to city hospitals a year from all of their animals.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So yeah, I want to just keep digging deeper with all of this, but I think, the number of zoo stories I can tell and that the archive will tell and other people will tell is probably endless. And it doesn't end even in this time period. I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this talk. One of the things I found was that in zoo guides, they'd have vaccination information for smallpox vaccination. And it would be like, you can get vaccinated at this site on this day, or you should get vaccinated because 3 people in Buenos Aires die a day from smallpox. And I was thinking about that and I was like, wait a second. And I went and did some research, and both the Argentine Zoo site and the Philadelphia Zoo were COVID vaccination sites just 3 years ago. And so I think, there's a lot to be thought about too with how all of this is playing out, not only in the US and Europe at the same time, but today in all of these countries as well. And how do we as individuals interact with animals and with zoo spaces when we go?
Oh, definitely. As you were talking, I was thinking about all the stories I tell my children about our dog
Oh,
to try to get them to see something my way.
mhm,
Health being a big one.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, you totally opened my eyes. Ashley, thank you so much. It's been so great to talk to you, and we wish you so much luck in finishing your book and all the stories that you have to share ahead.
Well, thank you so much. This was really a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.